Danielle Carter was ready to go home. The night had been a success, an evening spent among community leaders, veterans, and medical professionals, all gathered for a charity gala in Atlanta, Georgia, dedicated to providing prosthetic limbs for injured service members. As a 38-year-old military veteran and prosthetics engineer, this cause was deeply personal to her. She had walked in those same shoes, having lost part of her left leg during a combat deployment overseas. Thanks to advanced prosthetic technology, she had rebuilt her life, and now, she was helping others do the same. The fundraiser had gone better than expected, more donations than projected, more volunteers stepping forward, and more conversations about changing lives through innovation. But after hours of mingling, shaking hands, and standing in heels, she was exhausted. All she wanted was to get home to her husband and their 2 teenage boys. Sliding into the driver's seat of her black Ford Explorer, Danielle let out a slow breath, rolling her shoulders to ease the tension. She pulled out of the hotel's valet loop, merging onto a quiet road leading toward her suburban neighborhood. The city skyline faded in her rearview mirror, replaced by the dark stretch of tree-lined pavement ahead. Reaching for the Bluetooth button, she tapped it once. Call Jonathan. Her husband, Jonathan Carter, was waiting for her call. Newly appointed as the police chief of Fulton County, his schedule had been just as demanding as hers. Between balancing his responsibilities as a law enforcement leader and their roles as parents, nights like these when she had to attend formal events alone were becoming more frequent. As she waited for the call to connect, a sudden flash of red and blue lights filled her rearview mirror. Danielle's breath hitched. A police cruiser. Her first thought was a simple one. There must be some mistake. She instinctively checked her speedometer well within the limit. No missed stop signs. No broken taillights. No phone in her hand. So why was she being pulled over? Her fingers hovered over the Bluetooth button, debating whether to let the call go through or hang up. She exhaled, deciding against it. Best not to escalate things unnecessarily. With a steadying breath, she eased her SUV to the side of the road, pulling into a dimly lit stretch away from traffic. The glow of the police lights reflected off her rear window, painting streaks of red and blue across her dashboard. She shifted the car into park, resting both hands on the steering wheel, her heart beginning to race. Danielle had been through worse. She had faced war, faced injury, faced rehabilitation. But something about this moment, the uncertainty, the silence, the overwhelming sense of being watched made her uneasy. This wasn't just a routine stop. Something wasn't right. Danielle Carter gripped the steering wheel, forcing herself to breathe evenly as the officer approached. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and square-jawed, his presence imposing even in the dim glow of the streetlights. His badge read Sergeant Blake Carter, no relation. The hardness in his expression told her this wasn't going to be a polite conversation. License and registration. No greeting. No explanation. Just cold authority. Danielle exhaled slowly, keeping her movements deliberate as she retrieved her documents from her glove compartment. This wasn't her first time dealing with power trips in uniform. She handed them over. Evening, officer. Mind telling me why I was pulled over? Sergeant Carter barely glanced at her license before responding flatly. We received a report of a suspicious vehicle matching this description in the area. Danielle's brow furrowed. Suspicious? A black SUV? In Atlanta? That could be anyone. She kept her expression neutral, but her instincts screamed that something wasn't right. Step out of the vehicle, ma'am. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Excuse me. Step out. Now. His voice was firmer, his stance more rigid, more aggressive. Danielle felt her heartbeat quicken. Before she could even unbuckle, the situation escalated. 2 more police cruisers pulled up behind her, their headlights flooding the dark road with harsh white light. 3 more officers emerged, moving with an air of purpose and authority. Flashlights beamed into her car, sweeping across the seats, the dashboard, her hands. She had done nothing wrong, yet she was being treated like a threat. One officer, younger, jittery, barely in his 20s, made his way to the rear of her SUV. Before she could ask what he was doing, he popped open her trunk. Without permission, Danielle's pulse spiked. Hey, that's my personal property. She turned in her seat to get a better view, but one of the officers stepped closer, blocking her line of sight. The younger officer ignored her protest, rifling through the carefully packed boxes in the trunk. Inside were brochures, donation envelopes, and prototypes of prosthetic limbs, the same materials she had brought to the fundraiser for wounded veterans. Sergeant Carter walked over and grabbed one of the prosthetic legs. He turned it over in his hands, his expression unreadable, then looked at her with thinly veiled suspicion. "What's all this?" Danielle's patience was wearing thin. Her voice was steady but firm. "I'm an engineer. These are prosthetics for veterans amputees who serve this country." She had spent years working to restore dignity to those who had lost limbs in combat, helping warriors walk again. But right now, standing before these officers, she felt like she was the one being stripped of dignity. Sergeant Carter tossed the prosthetic leg back into the trunk like garbage, the hollow plastic clattering loudly against the metal floor. Danielle's jaw tightened. "Stay calm. Don't react. Don't give them a reason." She lifted her chin, keeping her voice measured. "I'd like to call my husband." The youngest officer scoffed, exchanging a smirk with his partner. "You can do that after we're done here." Danielle had had enough. Her entire body burned with frustration, but she refused to let them see it. She had fought too hard, survived too much, to be intimidated by men on a power trip. This wasn't about safety. This wasn't about protocol. This was about control, and she wasn't about to give them any more of it. Danielle forced her expression to remain neutral, though every nerve in her body was on high alert. "Stay calm. Stay composed." She took a slow breath, turning her gaze to Sergeant Carter. "I'd like to call my husband." He narrowed his eyes, lips pressing into a thin line. A pause. Then, with reluctant stiffness, he nodded. No sudden movements. The warning carried an unspoken threat, as if he expected her to lunge for a weapon instead of a phone. Danielle didn't acknowledge the insult. Instead, she moved with deliberate precision, keeping her hands visible as she reached toward the passenger seat. Her fingers wrapped around the cool metal of her cell phone, and she brought it to her lap. Unlocked. Dialed. The line barely rang once before Jonathan answered immediately. "Danny, I've been calling." She cut him off, keeping her voice steady, but urgent. "Jonathan, I'm being pulled over. They're searching my car without cause. I need you here. Now." A beat of silence. Then, Jonathan's tone changed completely. The casual concern from seconds ago vanished, replaced by cold authority. "Where are you?" Danielle rattled off the cross streets. "Stay put. I'm on my way." She ended the call, setting the phone on her lap, her grip tightening around it. When she looked up, she found several officers staring at her. They didn't know who she had just called, but they could sense the shift. Something about her composure unsettled them. Maybe it was the way she held herself, refusing to shrink under their scrutiny. Maybe it was the way she had said, "I need you here." Now, with absolute certainty, as if she knew the situation was about to change. Or maybe it was the fact that she wasn't afraid anymore. Minutes passed, each second dragging slower than the last. The officers continued their faux investigation, pretending to search for something, though it was clear they had already realized their mistake. One officer stepped away, murmuring something to Sergeant Carter. Carter gave a tight nod, but his expression remained unreadable. Then, the sound of a vehicle approaching broke the tense silence. The low rumble of a powerful engine, smooth and controlled. Headlights sliced through the darkness as a black Chevy Tahoe rolled up to the curb. The driver's door opened slowly, and then Jonathan Carter stepped out. The driver's door opened, and Jonathan Carter stepped out. The officers tensed immediately. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and composed, his Navy suit crisp, unwrinkled, as if he had just stepped out of a press conference rather than rushed to a tense roadside confrontation. The gold police badge clipped to his belt glinted under the streetlights, an unmistakable symbol of authority. He shut the SUV door behind him with deliberate control, his movements slow and precise, not rushed, not panicked, just measured and confident. Sergeant Carter stiffened, his expression no longer firm but calculating. The other officers exchanged glances, their postures shifting subtly. They didn't need introductions. They knew exactly who he was. Jonathan's voice, when he finally spoke, was even, controlled but unyielding. "I'm Jonathan Carter, Police Chief of Fulton County." He took a single step forward. His eyes swept over the officers, then locked on his Sergeant Carter. "Who wants to explain why my wife is being detained and her car searched without cause?" No one spoke. For the first time that night, the officers looked uncertain. The youngest one, the nervous officer who had been digging through Danielle's trunk, stepped back instinctively, his grip tightening around his flashlight. Sergeant Carter, clearly the one in charge, opened his mouth, but what came out wasn't confidence. It was hesitation. "Yes, sir. We received a report of suspicious activity involving a vehicle matching this description." Jonathan's jaw tightened, his stare unflinching. He let the words hang between them, studying Carter's face. Then he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Suspicious activity? His tone wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that silenced the night itself. His eyes moved deliberately from Carter to the other officers, making sure they felt the question settle. "You're talking about a black woman in a Ford Explorer coming from a charity event, with prosthetic limbs in her trunk?" Silence. The younger officer, now visibly uncomfortable, dropped his gaze to the ground. The older officer beside him shifted on his feet, but said nothing. Sergeant Carter's lips pressed into a thin line, his Adam's apple bobbing slightly as he swallowed. Jonathan took another step forward, closing the space between them. The tension was suffocating now. "Did she give you permission to search her vehicle?" More silence. Not a single officer met his eyes. Jonathan let the moment stretch, let them feel the weight of it. Then, after a beat, he exhaled, shaking his head. "That's what I thought." The energy of the scene had shifted. What started as a quiet, isolated stop had now become a public spectacle. By now, bystanders had gathered, standing along the sidewalk and in nearby parking lots. Some whispered among themselves, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Others simply stood frozen, eyes locked onto the scene unfolding before them. And then there were those who had their phones raised, recording every single moment. The flashing police lights bathed the scene in an eerie red and blue glow, the tension as thick as the humid Georgia air. Danielle finally broke the silence. Her voice was steady, but beneath it, there was something deeper: exhaustion, frustration, but most of all, certainty. "They wouldn't even let me make a phone call at first." Jonathan turned his gaze from her to the officers standing before him. His expression hardened, his voice dropping to a level that was somehow both calm and deadly serious. "Do you have any idea what kind of liability you just created for this department?" Sergeant Carter swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing slightly. The other officers stood rigid, shifting their weight as if the ground beneath them had suddenly become unstable. Jonathan let the question hang in the air. He looked at the growing crowd, at the faces watching, the phones recording, and shook his head. This isn't going away. The weight of those words settled over them like a heavy fog. He raised a hand and gestured toward the crowd, toward the dozens of people recording every second of this encounter. "You're going to explain yourselves right here, right now." Sergeant Carter's jaw tightened. The younger officer exhaled sharply, his grip tightening on his belt as he shifted uncomfortably. Jonathan could see the panic in their eyes. They knew. They knew they had overstepped. And now, there was no walking this back. No filing a quiet report. No brushing this under the rug. The moment would live on past this night on social media, in news headlines, in department meetings where serious questions would be asked. Sergeant Carter hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then reached for his radio. His fingers hovered over the button before he finally pressed it. His voice was tighter now, the confidence from earlier completely gone. "Calling my supervisor, sir." The night was far from over. The flashing lights continued their rhythmic swirl, casting streaks of red and blue across the pavement as the tension in the air thickened like fog. The gathered crowd had only grown larger, their voices a quiet hum as they whispered amongst themselves, phones still recording every second. Then, from a distance, the sound of another vehicle approaching cut through the night. A black and white police SUV rolled onto the scene, its tires crunching against the gravel before coming to a smooth stop. For a moment, the only sound was the low idle of the engine. Then, the driver's door opened. Out stepped Lieutenant Marcus Bennett, his uniform neatly pressed, his movements deliberate, practiced. But the moment his eyes landed on Jonathan Carter, something in his face changed. He went pale, his professional mask cracking just slightly. His feet hesitated mid-step, as if some deep instinct warned him that this situation was worse than he had expected. Jonathan saw the shift in his demeanor. He didn't move, didn't adjust his posture, he simply waited, letting the weight of his presence settle over the scene. Finally, Bennett swallowed hard and spoke. "Chief Carter." He cleared his throat, struggling for words. "I wasn't aware." Jonathan's expression remained ice cold, his jaw tight, his shoulders squared. "That's the problem." Bennett's brow furrowed. Jonathan took a step forward, gesturing toward the police cruisers, the officers standing awkwardly, the crowd watching every move. It shouldn't matter who she is. His voice was controlled, steady, unshakable. Bennett didn't respond immediately. Jonathan's eyes locked onto him, unrelenting. Every citizen deserves respect. And this. He swept a hand over the scene. The open trunk, the scattered prosthetic limbs, the tension still lingering in the air. This is unacceptable. A heavy silence followed. Lieutenant Bennett inhaled slowly, turning towards Sergeant Carter and the other officers. His expression was tight, unreadable, but his eyes carried an edge of restrained frustration. Did you search her car without cause? Silence. No one spoke. No one moved. No justifications. No explanations. Nothing. And in that still, heavy moment, Jonathan let out a short, humorless laugh. The kind of laugh that wasn't amusement, but rather disbelief, disappointment, and quiet fury all wrapped into one. He shook his head. And now it's all on camera. His gaze flicked to the crowd, to the dozens of smartphones capturing every detail. Whatever excuse they might have had, it was already too late. By morning, the footage was everywhere. What had started as a routine traffic stop had become a nationwide scandal. The video, captured from multiple angles, had been uploaded to social media, news websites, and television broadcasts. Within hours, it had gone viral, shared millions of times with captions like, "Harassed for no reason. Police chief's wife wrongfully detained." Veterans stopped, searched, and humiliated until they saw who she called. When will this end? Another incident sparks outrage. News anchors analyzed the footage, experts debated the implications, and public figures weighed in on the injustice. For the officers involved, there was no escaping the scrutiny. The press conference. Later that afternoon, Jonathan Carter stood at the podium. The city's official seal was displayed behind him, the backdrop of the Fulton County Police Department headquarters stark and formal. The room was packed. Journalists, reporters, activists, and concerned citizens had all gathered, cameras rolling, notebooks poised. Jonathan's expression was unreadable, his demeanor composed but firm. He adjusted the microphone, then let his gaze sweep across the audience. When he spoke, his voice was steady, unwavering. The events of last night were unacceptable. Flashes of cameras flickered, reporters murmuring as he continued. The actions of those officers were not just a violation of protocol. They were a betrayal of the trust that this department is meant to uphold. His fingers tightened on the edges of the podium, the only visible sign of the anger simmering beneath his controlled exterior. Effective immediately, the officers involved have been placed on administrative leave, pending a full and transparent investigation. A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the room. Jonathan let the statement settle before continuing. This department will no longer tolerate racial profiling, misuse of power, or violations of civil rights. Not under my leadership. Danielle speaks. As Jonathan stepped aside, all eyes turned to Danielle. She moved toward the podium with measured steps, her prosthetic leg making a faint but deliberate sound against the stage floor. Her posture was upright, strong, her face a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. The crowd hushed. She adjusted the microphone, then took a steadying breath. "I am not just an engineer," she began. Her voice was clear, but there was an undeniable edge of emotion behind it. "I am a veteran. I fought for this country. I lost my leg in combat. I served with honor, and I came home believing that my sacrifices meant something." A few heads nodded in agreement. Danielle's jaw tightened, her gaze sweeping across the room. "But last night, I wasn't treated like a veteran." She let the words hang in the air, the weight of them settling on every person present. "I was treated like a suspect." Silence. Then, applause erupted, sweeping through the crowd like a wave of emotion. Some clapped loudly, others stood from their seats. A few even wiped away tears. It was not just applause, it was a statement. A collective acknowledgement that what had happened to her was wrong. That this was bigger than her. That things needed to change. As the clapping continued, Danielle took another breath, steady and unshaken. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every person who had ever been unfairly targeted, profiled, and stripped of their dignity. She was done being silent. And so was the world. The fallout from that night didn't fade. It didn't become just another viral story, lost in the never-ending news cycle. It became a movement. Systemic change begins. In the weeks that followed, the pressure for real reform was undeniable. Fulton County's leadership couldn't afford to ignore what had happened, not when citizens, activists, and national media were still demanding answers. And so, under public scrutiny and the unwavering leadership of Jonathan Carter, changes were set in motion. Bias training became mandatory for all officers, not just a one-time workshop, but a recurring program designed to challenge racial profiling and discriminatory practices within the force. A Citizens Advisory Board was established, composed of community leaders, legal experts, and everyday residents who would oversee police conduct, review complaints, and ensure transparency. The officers involved faced serious consequences. One chose to resign before disciplinary measures could be finalized. The others? They weren't getting off easy. Internal investigations led to suspensions, retraining, and permanent records of misconduct. For many in the department, it was a wake-up call. For others, it was just the beginning. Danielle's fight continues. And what about Danielle? She refused to let this end with just policy changes and disciplinary action. She had spent years as an engineer designing prosthetic limbs for wounded veterans, restoring mobility and dignity to those who had served. But now, she had a new mission: to restore justice for those who had been silenced for too long. She became a public advocate, speaking at town halls, legal panels, and police reform summits. When asked why she kept fighting, she was clear and unwavering. This isn't just about me. She saw her own story reflected in so many others, people who didn't have a police chief for a husband, didn't have cameras recording their encounters, didn't have a viral video forcing accountability. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Reporters followed her, activists reached out, politicians cited her case in debates on police reform. Her story was bigger than a single incident. It was a catalyst for change. Because real change starts with accountability. And Danielle wasn't stopping until she saw it through.